I'm Sarah Pierson, co-founder of The Uncomfortable Conversation, and we are here today with Cecilia, and we are going to talk about uncomfortable conversations, and we might even have a few ourselves. So, welcome, Cecilia. Maybe we can start by having you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about kind of how you got started on your own journey of having uncomfortable conversations.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here. I'm so honored to be part of the uncomfortable conversation. I am a Filipina pleasure educator, advocate, and consultant. And I currently live in Boston, but grew up in Los Angeles. And it's still very hard for me to claim being a Bostonian, even though literally my 20th anniversary is tomorrow of living here. I came to Boston for grad school and I stuck around and I found my way into the sexuality field through social work. And I have a partner that I live with, as well as our 4-year-old, almost 5-year-old, and our cat Dorito. And yeah, I feel like I've been having uncomfortable conversations for most of my life at this point.
It's a long road
It
to,
is.
there's lots of opportunities to have uncomfortable conversations.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So I think, when we were talking about how we were going to frame this conversation today, I think for both of us, just our identities and experiences as people who have experienced sexual assault personally and sort of what that kind of pathway has looked like. And so I would love to just start with this idea. So I just blurted that out right here at the beginning of the so at the beginning of the conversation. But it kind of prompts this question of sort of to disclose or not to disclose. And I'm curious what that looks like. Sort of what has that looked like in your experience as a survivor? And maybe I have some stories I can share too. We can compare notes on that.
Yeah, definitely. My first real disclosure was around when I was 13, and it was to my friends. A situation sort of came up in which the abuse that happened to me when I was about 7 or 8 became confirmed. And it didn't feel comfortable for me to have the conversation with my family, mostly because there was this fear of am I going to mess up my family's structure? Am I going to be the one that causes a lot of harm? Even though obviously that's not the case, right? It wasn't my fault. It wasn't my doing. And so I felt like the safest people to talk to were my friends. And luckily, my friends, all of the friends that I ever talked to about it have always believed me. They've always listened and cared, and there was a little bit of do you need us to kick his butt? And I was like, no, we're teenagers. Let's not go there. When I was in college, I attended Take Back the Night events.
Too.
Oh my gosh. Every year they had one, and we would march around the campus, and at the end of every event was basically a storytelling situation where people would just go up to a microphone, share their story very briefly, and people would stand and witness. And it was amazing to me. I had never seen people be so open and honest with complete strangers before. And I decided to kind of go for it. My friends in my dorm also did it. And it was shocking to me how many of us there were. For so much of my teenage life, I assumed it was mainly me who had ever had that experience. Eventually, I told my parents. Not a fun time. They believed me too. And the thing that I feared would happen, which would be the breakdown of the way that our family related to each other, happened, essentially. Our house used to be the house where everybody would come over and have parties, and it was not the case anymore.
Yeah.
We had to make sure to tell other relatives about what had happened, and yeah, the breakdown
changes the disclosure inside of a family. I relate to that a lot. It's sort of it does change the family system. Is
It
that when you
does.
don't hold the secret anymore, it changes everything.
Everything,
And
yeah.
it hurts when things change sometimes.
Oh, yeah,
But
definitely.
so many of those, we did talk about this, but so many of these elements actually ring very true. So similarly, I had experienced abuse in early childhood, and it wasn't until my teenage years that I really came to understand what it was and was able to put words to it. And then I had this period of time in high school where it's like I told everyone. Like I was like I couldn't stop telling people, and I think part of it was just I was trying to process it and like make sense of it. And one of my really good friends at the time had also experienced sexual abuse by a family member, and so there was something about that ability to just be in the processing like with somebody else, and that was the same kind of
Yeah.
they didn't
I had a similar situation too.
yeah.
My best friend and I, like, that's how we really connected and got really close.
Yes, but it was to just there because there's something I think also about when you're in that family experience alone and you just haven't felt seen for so long, to like that feeling of being seen for even that sort of worst experience of your life, or just the way that you feel all of the things that you feel about it and they don't make any sense, especially when you're feeling them and your brain isn't fully developed because you're a teenager. So I think about that though, because at the same time we were a little bit of the blind leading, like we didn't know anything about healing. We hadn't built any skills around taking care of ourselves, but we were still there for each other in those moments. But then similar, like my mental perspective when I went to college was I really don't want to have to tell people this. So why don't I just get up on stage and tell everybody at the same time, and then I won't have to deal with this decision of should I tell them, should I not tell them. I always felt like I was oversharing or undersharing, or it's like, so it was just, so in my mind, it was this global solution to never having to have another disclosure. And then then I kind of learned that was not
Right.
what life was going to be like.
Yes, definitely. I think it was almost practice for me.
Yeah.
To lead up to telling my parents.
To telling your parents.
And I remember the
That makes
last
sense.
year of
So you
my
did the take
college.
back the night first,
Oh,
and
yeah.
then told your family.
Oh, yeah. And I remember thinking like, okay, in my senior year, like Take Back the Night is coming and I'm graduating this year. I think I have to tell my parents now so that I can kind of complete the journey of being so open in a way. Obviously, the journey was not completed and there's more disclosure that has to happen throughout my life. But yeah, it was, and it ended up being practice for me.
Well, so I had already told my parents, but then when I did my Take Back the Night talk, basically I printed it out and I mailed it to all of my extended family members with a note that essentially said, I'm not keeping the family secrets anymore.
Yeah.
And so that caused some conflict, but
yeah, I wrote a blog.
Oh.
It was around the time when like blogs were like really big. I just wrote a whole blog about it. I think it still exists somewhere in the internet.
Fascinating. So then it sounds like we had similar adolescent and college experiences. And then I guess what happened for me was that then I graduated from college and I entered adult life and I had a job. And this ultimately was part of the experience that led me to start the Uncomfortable Conversation, is I realized there were no more opportunities to bring it up. It's, I went to my job. I was in dating. Then I was back in this place of, even though I had done my best attempt of sharing it with the world so that I would never have to decide when to share it again, that came up for me. And so I'm curious whether you had the same experience and how you navigated it.
Yeah, there's actually a very specific situation that happened at a job once where I wasn't expecting to have to disclose necessarily. And then I ended up having to. It was essentially that I started attending like a group, like a support group for survivors. But I needed to, in order to make it there on time, it was in like Chinatown where I was working and I needed to come up here to Cambridge. I needed to leave early on specific days. And so I let my boss know like, hey, I need to leave for like a health related thing these next couple of weeks. And at one point he took me into the office and he was like, I don't know if we can use your sick time for this, your like health insurance time for this, because like, aren't you going somewhere to work? And I was like, no, I'm not leading the workshop. I'm not leading the group. I'm going there. It's a support group that I'm attending. And I had to be like, this is what's actually happening. Like, da, 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 da. And because I wasn't prepared for it, I 100% started like weeping, even though I was
Yeah,
like explaining to him exactly what was
Yeah.
happening in a very clear way. And he was like, like not prepared for that conversation at all, and he's like, I'll be right back, and he went to get one of my coworkers who I was really
Consult
close
HR
with.
quickly.
It was so awkward for him, and meanwhile I'm like, I just don't know why I had to explain this. Like, I wasn't lying about why I was leaving,
Right.
you know?
It's I don't think I've had as many experiences needing to disclose at work. In my current role, there's been a little bit more of a decision process of in my first set of jobs, I don't think I shared that part of my experience at all. And it was a little bit of feeling like I kind of had gone back into the closet. And so it was something that came up for me more maybe in my early 30s as I transitioned out of one career path into another. And so I became a little bit more intentional about sharing it. And now, particularly as a leader, as I have a team that I lead, I'm at a larger organization, and I know that I share it so that I can create space to normalize those kinds of things, or to normalize everyone on my team if they need to go to a therapy appointment or a mental health appointment. It's just not a big deal. It's like, great, okay, let's go, do what you need to do, because I need all of you here to be healthy doing your job.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting too, being a sex educator essentially, and knowing that is part of why I've done the work, and part of why I'm doing the work that I'm doing is because specifically I want to use sex education as a way to help prevent it from happening for others. And so for a long time in my early years, I focused a lot more on this is very punny, but the ins and outs of sex education. And I tried very much to like separate being a survivor with the education that I was providing. And I realized that did not work at all, because in order to provide, I think that if you're going to provide comprehensive sex education, especially to youth, it has to be trauma informed. And most of the work that I do now is with adults, and especially then it needs to be trauma informed, because so many people are walking around and you just never know, who has had a trauma history.
What were some of your hesitations about sharing, they're disclosing within the context of that work?
I think there was a worry of, oh, well, I'm talking about pleasure specifically, but if I bring up this really hard conversation, even briefly, that it might take away the pleasure aspect for other people. But I realized later on that the pleasure aspect for me is very much a mode of healing. And so being able to infuse my work with that, I think, has helped me do my work better.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I know we talked a little bit about this idea of some of the assumptions that people have about survivors and their sexuality. And so I'm wondering if we can riff on those a little bit.
Absolutely. I mean, we could go into the really negative stereotypes that like, oh, well, either you're, absolutely anti-sex.
Right. Like sex will never feel good to you.
Right. Sex
It's
will
like,
never
I better
feel
not
good.
touch you. I'm afraid I'm going to hurt you. It's going to be
Right.
traumatizing and triggering.
Right.
Or
you become like hypersexualized, and it's like, oh, well, that's why you're dating around or sleeping with multiple
Right.
people or whatever, and that is somehow negative. That's a negative thing that you're doing. And like, I have to admit that I went through what I called my like slutty summers. And for me, it was very much being able to control the situation. And this was very early on in the beginning stages of like OkCupid, and like Craigslist wasn't scary back then. And so like to be able to have control over who I was letting into my bedroom or who I was going to see, for me was part of my healing journey.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's not the same for everybody, right? Like, I'm not here to be like, okay, everybody, you know, like, go ahead and like slut it up, though. Like, I encourage it, but also if you don't want to,
if it works for you,
right,
do it and don't
right,
feel shame. And if it doesn't work for you, don't do it and don't feel
right,
shame.
exactly. And so turning it into a like, oh, well, it's because it's like a causation thing, right? People, I feel like, take this like, oh, well, because you are a survivor, because you experienced abuse, then you're doing problematic things. And I think that adding the good or bad value to the person's like healing is potentially harmful.
Right. I think I've had to work very hard in different areas of my life to understand like what is because I am a survivor. And then at this point, it's like, is there really a causation or is it just I am who I am?
Right.
And does it matter? And as long as I accept myself and work on myself and continue to grow, because there is something I think that does get internalized, at least for me, just having experienced something like that kind of trauma so early on, is that there is this deep question of like, am I okay? Was it something I did, right? And so there's all these different layers that, at least for me, that I've had to learn to let that go a little bit more.
Definitely.
But
Definitely. Well, I think it informs our decisions a lot of the time. You
yeah,
know, the experience, all of our previous experience kind of helps to inform the decisions that we make as we continue on in life. But it doesn't necessarily define who we are. Like it's just one part of us,
yes,
right? Yeah.
yeah, no, exactly. But I think for me, it was sex and emotions together was the most challenging. And
Yeah.
so there was a little bit of a let me figure these two paths out separately and then see how they might overlap in the future. But I think I remember having a part of this was in college, and it was just the idea that sex was supposed to feel good was like a new concept for me. It's like,
Yeah.
oh, great. This is not a way that you get somebody to love you or to care about you or to respond to you in a certain way, but that it was just something that you could experience, enjoy. You could like the person afterwards, but you didn't have to.
Right. Yes. I love that.
So tell me again about the survey.
Oh, yes. I realized that there isn't a whole lot of information about specifically Filipino sexuality and sexual behaviors. And so I decided, because I had the time, to draft and create this huge survey that involved questions about, you know, where they live, who they are, their connection to the Filipino culture, whether they have engaged in really specific sexual behaviors, and whether they liked it or didn't like it. And I also asked about their sexual violence history. Out of those 32, there were 60% of those respondents said that they had some sort of sexual assault or sexual violence history, which is huge. It's a huge number. Honestly, it surprised me. That's the part that surprised me the most. There were certain things that I wasn't necessarily surprised about. Like, I asked who they talked to about their sexual experiences, and the majority of people said their friends who are not Filipino versus their friends who were Filipino, interestingly. And I think that brings in a little bit of the cultural piece of like, you know, sexuality, specifically mostly for like Filipino Americans, is not a conversation that we have very often. It's very like, oh, ha ha ha, he, you know, we're gonna like joke about it, but we're not gonna like have the serious conversations. And really the serious conversation is don't get pregnant, you know, just don't do it until you're married. You know, those are the conversations that I know I had with my parents. I was not very good at listening to them, unfortunately. But anyways, that's a sidebar.
Leaves a few things out.
Yes. And so I know that the current rates of sexual violence or sexual assault specifically is 1 in 4 women, 1 in 6 men,
Yeah.
and about half of trans and non-binary folks have experienced some form of sexual assault or sexual violence. And so the 60% number was shocking to me. And it begged the question of, what about our experiences as Filipinos, as Filipino Americans, has led us to not have these conversations as often, considering that there may potentially be a high rate of this occurring? And how do we start having these conversations? I mean, I'm of the mind of like, I'm just going to walk into the room and we're going to have the conversation in a way. And I know that a lot of folks aren't necessarily ready for that, because there is the familial piece of like, is this going to affect how people see me? Is this going to affect how people see my family, even if the perpetrator of their abuser was not part of the family? Though according to that survey, the majority of them were
family members.
Yeah.
There are considerations, right? And so I think it's my story to tell. And there are impacts of me telling my story on people that are not me. And so, and I do think about what, and sometimes it's about what details I share or what details I don't share. Because there are layers within, particularly within family stories.
Yeah.
It's
not, definitely.
You're not usually the only one.
Right. There's that piece. Yeah.
But thank you for sharing that. I think the survey, what is interesting to me has been doing this work, and my audience has been different. So you're thinking about within the Filipino community, and I was much more interested in how these conversations were showing up around men, but similarly was surprised at when I would go into I did about 100 of these conversations where I'd say, you don't need to know anything about this topic. I'm just kind of really interested in learning or understanding how men come to it. And without it, every single person would have something to say, whether it was about somebody that they knew as a survivor. I had men share experiences that they didn't categorize as sexual assault. I remember a man told me a story about essentially being kind of chased down an alleyway and groped.
Oh, wow.
But did not describe that as an experience of sexual assault. It was like, oh, I had this one sort of creepy thing happen to me one night.
Right.
And it's interesting I think the way that people choose to name or not name their experiences, or when they choose to name them as well. But it's when you ask, right? And so I would imagine that you set the table in a way that it sounds like pretty comprehensive to a group of people that matter to you. But it does make me think a little bit about where other places that disclosure. So we talked about work, we talked about our own curiosity of asking others, how we've shared our experiences intentionally in ways that allow other people to reciprocate or to find a little bit more space or support or healing. I'm wondering if there's other experiences. How about I'll just ask about a few audiences and we'll see if we have any stories to share. So, doctors. One place that this idea of disclosure has come up for me is in healthcare. And so I know that you have some experience in healthcare. And so I'm wondering if you can, just from a social work perspective, help us set the table for what trauma-informed care is.
Yeah. So trauma-informed care essentially means that you are coming from a place of understanding that sexual violence happens, that it may potentially have happened to your client, and that you are aware that certain things may or may not trigger your client or activate your client in a way that, makes them remember very, directly what might have happened to them. And so being able to have the information, whether or not you know for a fact that they've experienced trauma, being able to recognize that it is a thing that happens, and that there's a potential that the person you're working with has experienced that, can help to create a much more informed, caring, and compassionate space for folks.
I do some work around contraceptive access and care. And so we talk about the idea of patient-centered care, which is essentially very similar to trauma-informed care. And so one of the things that we talk about is this idea that it's being knowledgeable about what the options are, presenting those and having shared decision making with somebody. And so it's as you're thinking about the journey into the healthcare visit, the experience between the provider and the patient, and then to some extent, the idea of people are in charge of their own bodies and their own care. And so the more information that you have, it's actually better healthcare when you understand. It's like if you want me to do something, but I'm not going to do it because it doesn't work for me or it triggers me, then maybe we should brainstorm some other ideas.
Right.
I want to rely on your expertise and your experience. It's not about being patient directed, but it's really about how do we bring the best of all of us into the world. And so it can be little things like consent for touch, or it can be bigger things like here are the options that might be more meaningful to you. And so trauma-informed care also helps, I think, to a lot of ways reduce bias in healthcare too, which is another really important health equity issue.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. They really kind of are interwoven
Yes, exactly.
at the end of the day.
When do you share? Do you check because there isn't a box always.
There isn't a box always, which is so unfortunate. There have been very few instances where it's part of the intake paperwork, and there's honestly less experiences of them asking you directly, for sure.
No, there's none. I had a colonoscopy, which is a pretty invasive medical procedure. And I remember going to the prep and they asked me if I was experiencing domestic violence at home. So did I feel safe at home? They did not ask me about a sexual violence history, although they were about to sedate me and insert something into my body. And apparently the drug they give you makes you like super out of it. So when the doctor called me a couple days later to give the results, I bring this up with the doctor. And I was like, look, like you really should be, how are you screening for sexual violence? Like, what is your perspective on being trauma informed? He said, we had this conversation.
That's so funny.
It's like, he's like, it's very normal not to remember.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. The one time I have had the question asked in an intake form was actually at a Body Works place. Like it was right before a massage. Yeah. It was this amazing like massage place down in DC that unfortunately had to close its doors. But yeah, it's shocking to me how very little they ask.
It is.
And when I remember being pregnant and like in the bed and about to go into getting my C-section. And I remember sitting there and being like, none of these doctors, except for my own doctor, knows about my trauma history.
Yeah.
And that's weird.
That is weird.
Yeah.
I had a very similar experience, but just going back to the doctor, there is, I think, do I want this documented in my medical records? So I do think about that sometimes. And I also think about the idea that being a trauma-informed medical practice doesn't hurt anybody who hasn't experienced this at any point. And so I think about that. I did a training. I led a training with a friend of mine for a set of OBGYN. So this going back to and I was surprised at how hungry they were for information about how to support survivors. And it wasn't that they didn't know or understand. There was, what I heard in those conversations was a little bit more of a hesitance of, I only have 15 minutes to provide medical care, and do I want to bring up something or open up something that is going to be traumatic by asking?
Yeah.
And so I thought I did think about that. But in the wake of that, my OBGYN actually had been in the training. And so then when I went back to have my next appointment with her, we ended up having a great conversation. And where we landed was they're just going to give me an Ativan before so I schedule all of my invasive medical procedures together. I have somebody drive me and take me home. I just like get it all done. And that works for me. Right. And so, but it wasn't until the ice was broken in that way.
Oh yeah,
but
definitely.
Waiting for your patient to find the right moment is a tricky one.
Yeah. I feel like I've done most of the choosing to disclose. They leave
Right.
this sort of like, is there anything else you want us to know? And I'm like, okay, well, here we go. Are you ready for this?
Right.
You know, but it feels like, I happen to be really comfortable talking about it,
Right.
but I know there are plenty who aren't. And I think it would just be helpful to have, medical professionals be trauma informed.
Lately, I've been saying more, I have PTSD. And here's something here's what I'm asking for as a result of that. And sometimes that just feels better as a conversation because I am also aware that whether you're a medical provider or anybody else, is that I don't need, maybe today is not the day that I feel like having a whole long conversation or looking at their face when when they have a reaction. But it's
Gosh, yeah.
no, it's right. It's
The reaction.
Right, the reactions are. What are some of your most memorable reactions?
Oh gosh.
And how do you avoid that? How do you sort of play that calculus of like, sometimes I just want to share this it is a fact of my life. Like, I have 2 arms and I am a sexual assault survivor.
Yeah.
Can we move on in the conversation?
Yeah.
I don't need you to say, I'm so sorry, or.
Yeah. I think for me, I know that I have to prepare to fill the empty space that might occur afterwards. So, just like talking about, even sharing the fact that I'm a survivor speaker for the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center, like saying all of
You're
those
not the
words.
first. This is not the first time I'm telling somebody.
Right. Or like there was definitely a time where I was hanging out after school with the moms of my kids' classmates, and we were at a park, and I don't know why it came up, but I was like, oh yeah, I was at this thing and I had a speaking engagement for the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center, and this is what happened. And they were like, oh, okay. And you could tell that there was a little bit of like, what happens now? And I was like, oh, so then I kept the conversation going and like trying to relate it back to what we were talking about and, being able to fill in that space. But I've also had people be like, and they give you the look of like,
Yes, the look.
oh, okay.
Are you okay?
Do I need to be very gentle and like cautious with you? And sometimes I get the like gentle shoulder pat, which I'm like,
Please don't touch
why
me.
is this happening right now? Yeah.
What about me sharing that experience would make you think that your next best move would be to touch me?
Right. It's like, okay, cool. Thanks.
So, yeah. No, I used to experiment on dates, particularly. So if I knew the date wasn't going anywhere, sometimes I'd like just blurt it out, see what happens.
Amazing. Oh my gosh.
So given all of these awkward disclosure experiences that both you and I have had, what guidance could we give people? So if somebody does share their experience, because I think, I would first want to say even those awkward moments are usually fine. And I would prefer to have somebody err on the side of overreacting or checking in and saying, thank you for sharing. I feel like is always a really good place to start.
Yes.
What else? I think if it's clear in the way that I've disclosed that it's clearly not happening to me right now, then the thank you for sharing. Is there anything? It's like, I don't know. Where would we tell people to go after that?
Definitely. Thank you so much for sharing your experience. If you feel like you want to be like, I'm sorry that you ever had to experience that, and then sort of moving along. I think there's also this like being very present situation that can happen where you're not suddenly like fidgeting, but you're maintaining eye contact as much as feels comfortable without intensity.
So it's like sit with the discomfort of the disclosure instead of doing something to avoid it.
Correct.
Right. So I think that's a good one.
Yeah.
So let the other person let the person who's disclosed change the subject or move on and follow. I would say follow their lead.
Follow their lead. Definitely.
So do they want to share more, or do they want to get back to the conversation, or do they want to change the subject?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like if someone is feeling comfortable enough to have that disclosure with you, then they trust you enough to be able to hold something like that. And I think, it's fine to be like, wow, like that's really intense, and thank you for sharing with me, and let me know what you would like from me.
Right.
is also another way
That,
to
oh, I like that.
find
I
out.
do like that one. No, and I love that point too of if somebody has disclosed to you, your first response should be, wow, like this, I must have done something right because this person is trusting me.
Right.
And then when you respond from that place, I think you're less likely to be awkward or uncomfortable because you know that nothing's wrong.
Right.
This person didn't share this with you because something is wrong in most cases. They're sharing, and even if it was something that had just happened right before, if they're sharing with you, it means that they're trusting you to help them process an experience that somebody else already made it bad. Like you're not
Right.
making it worse. Even
Right.
like the worst, I mean, again, there have been I've had some pretty bad responses,
Yeah.
but even the worst verbal response that I've had about disclosing was not as bad as actually being sexually abused. So like,
yeah.
I think you should just also feel confident that, and if you're asking yourself, gosh, that was really bad, it's probably not as bad as you think it was.
Right. And I think it's okay to ask them,
Yeah.
you know, like, hey, I don't know if I was super awkward. You know, please let me know how I could be more supportive, how I
Right.
can be a better friend, a better partner,
Right.
or what have you.
Right.
Yeah.
I'd also feel like a hot tip would be if somebody does disclose something to you, don't make the survivor bring it up again. Like find a way to just like open the door a little bit if they, not later not later that day, but maybe a few days later
Yeah.
or in the next week. Cause I think that's sometimes I've shared something and then the person never asks me about it again or doesn't reference that part of my identity. And so I think that give it some space and like let there be a little bit of curiosity
Yeah,
too.
definitely. I don't think that there's necessarily anything wrong with asking, do you feel comfortable telling me more about that?
Yeah.
Because it gives the survivor the space and the choice to do so,
Or to say
or
no.
to say no.
I'd rather not.
Right. That's very powerful.
Yes. I love that. So I think just maybe to wrap us up, just as we're kind of ending, one of the things we talk about in the uncomfortable conversation is that it's like sometimes these conversations are uncomfortable. So whether we're talking about a disclosure, whether we're talking about being supported in our lives as survivors, responding to a disclosure in a healthy or happy way, that even if the conversation, like I think about there's, just we're sharing these examples of where conversations didn't go well. And I just don't want anybody to walk away feeling like, well, then I just shouldn't have the conversation.
Right.
But when we think about how those conversations add up over the course of time, so the playground conversation, hopefully what that means is that next time they'll do it better, right? So that even the mess ups might not feel good for me in the moment, but if they can help somebody else in the future, then, feels worthwhile to me is a little bit. But we think about those conversations as just lights that light up our own pathway and the pathways for the, sadly survivors that will come after us or are not as far on their healing journey. And so I'm wondering if you can share any just conversations that have been really meaningful to you in your journey as a survivor. You shared a really sweet story about your partner too, about a night that
yeah.
you had a nightmare.
I did, yes.
That was really sweet.
Yeah. So my nightmares, unfortunately, manifest is like intruder things, and sometimes it's zombies. Sometimes it's just like
subconscious
random
doesn't make
person.
sense.
Yeah. Sometimes it's a random person, just like wanting to come into my house. And so one night I woke up from a nightmare because I really felt like someone had gotten into our apartment. And we have a tiny apartment. Like you could look out of our bedroom door and see the front door, like it's not huge. And I woke him up because I like jostled up out of bed. And I was like, I feel like someone's in the house. Like, I need you to check. And he was groggily like, okay, like, let me just like see what's going on. I'm going to turn on the lights. And he slowly like walked through each room and was like, okay, I'm in the living room. Lights are on. Nobody's here. Went to the bathroom. Nobody is here. The lights are on. Went to the kitchen. Nobody's here. I don't see anything. The lights are on here now. And he slowly like walked back to the bedroom and he asked me, how am I feeling? That I know that this is a nightmare. Whenever you're ready, you and I can go into the other rooms and we can both turn off the lights together. And whenever you're ready, which honestly, I've never expected anyone to do that for me, but it was one of those moments of like, wow, you're giving me back a sense of safety and a sense
Yeah.
of power in my own home after this like very intense experience that was just a dream. So we kept him. He's still around.
It is amazing just those little moments and how when somebody can really respond in a way that lets you know that they see your experience
Yeah.
and doesn't question it and it doesn't make you feel like you're something wrong for it.
Right,
And I think
right.
I've had a similar experience with my partner who, for me, it's if I am asleep or sleepy, if somebody's coming into the bed, that will startle me. And every time it's me. It's me.
Yeah.
And it can be just such a small little thing, but those ways that we can heal together. And so I think that sometimes those conversations that can be really tremendously healing, just tiny little moments like that.
Yeah.
And so that's great.
Absolutely.
Well, I really appreciate you being here today. I
gosh.
really enjoyed talking with you. And, I think, for those that are out there watching and listening, if you are ready to take some more steps in the uncomfortable conversations and what that journey looks like in your life, you can check out the Uncomfortable Conversation on Instagram or YouTube and see many, many more examples of both getting the conversations right and getting it wrong. So thanks again for being with us.
Thank you so much.